Okay. So again, as I said, today I just started the recording. And today we're talking about Rambam's messianic era. Last time I mentioned what Rambam says about the Garden of Eden, where despite the fact that Rambam is well aware that the Midrashim all refer to the Garden of Eden as something after death, as some type of sachar, some type of reward of the afterlife, Rambam is not willing to accept this definition. For Rambam, there is olam haba, and he talks about that at the end, the world to come, but he refuses to refer to it as Gan Eden. In my humble opinion, the reason is that he's trying to, this is an educational, I call it Rambam's educational approach. It's in a few places. You can find this in his works, where he realizes that if he calls it Gan Eden, then everything that the Quran sees about Gan Eden, the Jews living in the Muslim countries will think, okay, it's all the same. Because not everybody is able to go into the fine differences. And so if say Jews believe in Gan Eden and Muslims believe in Gan Eden, it comes out all the same. So in the Quran, it says that Gan Eden is a physical place or a physical reward after death. That's obviously what the Jews believe in too. So you have two possibilities. You can either say, no, it means something else by us, or you can say, doesn't mean anything by us. Rambam prefers the doesn't mean anything. Because in the Bible, if you remember, Sefer Breshit, Gan Eden is a place. There's no place in the Torah where it says Gan Eden is after death. So Rambam decides to go back to the biblical point of view. Gan Eden is this place somewhere between Iraq and southern Turkey. And that's it. So, in other words, it's some beautiful place. Maybe one time we'll find this place. Even if it wasn't written in the Torah, there should be a place like that. Maybe it's the Bahamas. Maybe it's Jamaica. In other words, it almost sounds comic, but what he's doing is he's totally he's totally emptying the meaning of Gan Eden from anything eschatological. Eschatological, things that have to do with the eschaton, a Greek word for the end of days. Achreit hayamim. And then there's Gehinnom. Now, what is Gehinnom? Let's go back to what we were reading last time. This is again from Rambam's commentary on the Mishnah that he writes as a very young man. And we'll see later on that a lot of these ideas he still held in his later years. So, where are we? I just have to find it for a moment. Yeah, here it is. Should be one word. In the Hebrew, they separate it, but in English, they don't. That's Tchiat HaMeitim. Here, Gehinnom. Gehinnom, however, is the name for the pain and the punishment that will come to evildoers. Now, which pain and punishment to the evildoers? In this world, in the world to come? He doesn't say. But the Talmud did not give a definitive description of the punishment. For those who say that the sun will approach them and burn them, and their proof is from where it says in Malachi, behold, the sun day is coming burning like a furnace. And there are those who say it's a strange heat which will beginning their bodies and burn them. Their proof is from what it says in Yeshayahu, the spirit is fire, it shall consume you. That's all he says. By the way, another general rule about Rambam. Whenever he says there are those who say, and there are those who say, it means he doesn't agree with any of them. You can check this, by the way. Whenever he says there are those who say, there are those who say, it means he disagrees with both sides. And he has a different end. Let's just think logically for a second. If Gehinnom is a concept of divine punishment for the wicked, so where could it possibly take place? In this world? We don't see it happening. If anything, The Bible is full of the idea of Rasha v'Tovlo, that there are evil people who do quite well in this world. That's the book of Job. And it's also Yirmiyahu. Madur derech etzayim salecha. Yirmiyahu says, why do the wicked prosper? According to the Talmud, even Moses wanted to know why sometimes saintly people have a difficult time and wicked people prosper. So it definitely is not in this world. So it could only be in the afterlife. But Rambam doesn't mention that. He sort of like says there's such a thing and then just keeps going. Again, what's going on here is he says, yes, Gehinnom refers to the punishment. I'm not going to talk about it because I don't know anything about it. By the way, Rambam in his Hilchot Shuvah, which he writes at a much later age, he says all these things, lo nida ech sheyeh ad sheyeh. We won't really know what it is until it happens. So even in the redemption, we'll know exactly what it's going to be when it happens. Before that, it's speculation. So definitely things that are after this world, for Rambam, is speculation. So it says, is Gehinnom punishment? Yes. For Rambam, really, the partnership is like this. You have the world to come and Gehinnom. And Eden is not part of the partnership. What we find in the Midrash, Gan Eden and Gehinnom, Rambam turns into Olam Haba and Gehinnom. By the way, for Rambam, Olam Haba is after death, where you have a reward for the soul without the body, what Rambam calls the intellectual soul. Obviously, the body perishes because it belongs to this world, so the soul continues. And when the soul continues, it gets rewarded in the world to come. So if anything is a pair, there's a world to come, there's Gehinnom. Rambam also doesn't go into the questions like, is Gehinnom temporary? Is it punishment for sin and then you continue? All these questions with the Zoharic literature goes into great detail. Rambam does not discuss because he doesn't like discussing things that he doesn't know. In that sense, he's very modest. But he will discuss the Messianic era because there's literature about that, both in the Bible and in the Talmud, and therefore he will discuss it. Okay, we keep going. One other thing he mentions before we get to this. Tiyat HaMetim, revival of the dead. Tiyat HaMetim. And how do I move this away? Here. So, the revival of the dead, Tiyat HaMetim, all of a sudden he brings that up, is a main fundamental principle of Moshe, our teacher. There is no religion and no attachment to Jewish religion for one who does not believe in this, but is only for the righteous. And so too, this is found in the language of the Midrash Breshit Rabbah. The power of rain is for the righteous and for the evildoers. The revival of the dead is only for the righteous. This is also brought down in the Talmud in Ta'anit. The Talmud in Ta'anit says, Gadol Yom HaGeshamim Yoter Mitchiat HaMeitim. The day when it rains, like yesterday, is a greater event than the resurrection of the dead. Because when it rains, that's God's abundance for both saintly people and wicked people together. But Tchiat HaMeitim is only for the righteous. That's what the Talmud says. So therefore, when it rains, it's a greater event because it can happen both for the righteous and the wicked. But Tchiat HaMeitim is only for the righteous. Then Rambam continues. How should the evildoers be revived? They're already dead in their lifetime. Why should there be revival of the dead of the wicked people when they didn't even live the first time? Because after all, the Talmud says in Brachot, evildoers are called dead even in their lifetimes. Righteous people are called living even in their death. You remember the Talmud says that about Yaakov. The Talmud says Yaakov Avinu lo meit. Yaakov Avinu never died. And Talmud says, what do you mean he never died? It says in the Torah there was a funeral, he was buried. Talmud says, well, it's to teach you that tzaddikim, righteous people, even when they're dead, they're considered alive. Afilu b'mitatam nikraim chayim. So Let me just mention a word about this because Rambam says very little about this. By the way, because Rambam, the young Rambam, wrote so little about Tchiyat HaMeitim here in this introduction to the Mishnah of Sanhedrin Perek Chelek, he was attacked by the rabbis in Provence who claimed that he didn't believe in it. But Rambam, the reason why he writes so little about it is because he just doesn't know what to say. He knows that the Talmud talks about Tchiyat HaMeitim, resurrection of the dead. He knows that the Talmud says that it's some type of reward for the righteous, but since he hasn't a clue what it is, he doesn't say anything. Simple as that. Now, later on, after he's attacked by the rabbis of Provence, years later, he will write a treatise called Ma'amar Tchiyat HaMeitim. It's called the Treatise of the Resurrection of the Dead, where again he says, look, of course I believe in this, I just don't know what more to say about it, but I do believe it. So the truth is that the reason why he was attacked by the rabbis of Provence probably had nothing to do with whether he believed in it or not. It was the way he presented it. But this is a discussion by itself. Remember, the Rambam, Maimonides, lives in 12th century Cordova. And then he moves later on in his life to Egypt, where he becomes the physician for the king. At that time in Provence, you had the Ra'avad, Avraham ben David of Posquer. I think he's called the third Ra'avad. And Avraham ben David from Posquer is also a famous halachist. He wrote a book called Balei Nefesh about Jewish law. And he also wrote a glossary, or you might say, and that's Hit Nagdut, we call it Hasagot in Hebrew. He wrote every place where he disagrees with Rambam's Mishnah Torah, basically. Remember Rambam in his 50s, he wrote the Mishnah Torah much later on in life. That's his 14 volumes on Jewish law, which I consider probably one of the greatest feats of a human being without a computer and without staff, because Rambam's Mishnah Torah put together for the first time in Jewish history Talmudic laws according to his own codified system. It's not like the Rif, Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, who wrote a commentary, let's say, on every tractate, every Masechet of the Talmud, and summarized the halachic discussions. And it's not like the Rosh, who did the same thing. What Rambam did was, he took the whole Talmud, and he broke it up into 14 categories, which he created in his mind. And these categories were the laws of the holidays, and the laws of Shabbat, and the laws of the temple, and the laws of Yom Kippur, and the laws of damages, and the laws of kings, and everything in 14 volumes. Now, just to understand how difficult this is, let's say you want to write a volume on the laws of Shabbat. It's not enough to know the Talmud Masechet Shabbat backwards and forwards, because the Talmud talks about Shabbat also when it talks about Sukkot that falls out on Shabbat. The Talmud talks about Shabbat when it talks about Purim, which falls out on Shabbat. The Talmud talks about Shabbat when it talks about Pesach, which comes out on Shabbat. You understand what I'm saying? The Talmud talks about Shabbat when it talks about Yom Tov in Masechet Beitzah. So you can't just know the tractate of Shabbat. You have to know the whole Talmud backwards and forwards just to know what the Talmud says about Shabbat. Now, to make this even more complicated, in the Rambam's halacha, he also brings everything the Yerushalmi says about Shabbat. And whenever there's an argument between the Yerushalmi and the Bavli, Rambam, and this is quite exceptional, has a tendency to make a psak according to the Talmud Yerushalmi, which is very exceptional. Normally, most poskim follow just the Bavli. So this is a man who had the who without a computer, without a staff, while he was a physician in the court, he put together 14 volumes. He had to know the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud backwards and forwards in his mind to write this. It's mind-boggling that one human being could do such a thing. You know, there's still people who think there were a few Rambams. It's quite mind-boggling what he was able to do. Yes, Monsieur Moshar.
Thank you. Okay, just a question. How would you compare those 14 volumes with the Shulchan Aruch?
Well, the 14 volumes of the Rambam, which is written in the 12th century, is one of the three pillars of the Shulchan Aruch of Yosef Karo. When Yosef Karo wrote his Shulchan Aruch, he based his Sikat Halacha on three books, which were the main three books published during the time of the Rishonim on Halacha. That's first the Rif, Yitzchak Alfasi, which basically, instead of writing a code, he just summarized the halachot of the Talmud at the end of the Masech. It's Rambam's Mishnah Torah. That was attempt number 2. So Rif is 11th century, Rambam is 12th century, and then 14th century you have the Rosh, Asher ben Yechiel. So what the Shulchan Aruch does is he basically takes these three books as if they're a Beit Din. Wherever 2 out of 3 agree, that's the halakha.
Mm-hmm.
That's Yosef Karo. What the Ramah does, Moshe Isserlich, the Ashkenazic commentator on the Shulchan Aruch, because he follows the Rosh only, and the Jews living in Poland at the time were following only the Rosh. So every time the minhag of southern Poland Galicia is different than the Shulchan Aruch, because remember Shulchan Aruch, you have one from Morocco, that's the Rif, you have Rambam from Spain, and then you have the Rosh. So there's only one Ashkenazi there, facing 2. So every now and then the halakha does not follow the Rosh. By the way, and that's despite the fact that the Rosh was the Rav Rashi of Spain at the end of his life, which is also an interesting story. But so every time the Ramah says, every time the halakha does not follow the Rosh, the Ramah says, in our areas, we do it differently. And that is the glossary of the Ramah, what's called the Haggahat of the Ramah and the Shulchan Aruch. So the Shulchan Aruch is Yosef Karo. His main psak is when 2 out of 3 agree, or all 3 agree. And the Ramah, who basically follows the Rosh. So, okay. So, yeah, by the way, when Rambam wrote his Mishnah Torah, which was really before his time, because, as I said, in the introduction to his Mishnah Torah, he wrote a statement which today makes a lot of sense, but you have to understand how innovative this was in those days, to write a codex of Jewish law. It didn't exist. There was the Talmud, and there was commentaries on the Talmud. That was it. The Rambam writes at the introduction to his Mishnah Torah, now that I've written the Mishnah Torah, anybody can understand Jewish law, even if they didn't study the Talmud. Now that sounds great, right? Here you have something user-friendly for everybody. However, the rabbis in Provence, like the Ravad, all they could see was red lights. Like we would say in modern Hebrew, lama miata. You're writing a book, a codex, and you're saying we don't have to study the Talmud anymore? So everything they saw about the Mishnah Torah, they could only see red lights of warnings. And eventually, they wanted to put Rambam into cherem, not because of his Guide for the Perplexed, which was Aristotelian, based on Aristotelian approach, but because of his Mishnah Torah. It's really quite something. Okay, so let's get back to this. So for Rambam, so as I said, the Ravad, the reason why the Ravad didn't like what the Rambam wrote about Tchiyat HaMetim, my opinion, had nothing to do with what he said about Tchiyat HaMetim. It had to do with the fact that the Ravad, according to what we know, and it was Gershon Shalom who pointed this out the first time, the Ravad seems to be the beginning, what we call the Kabbalistic literature in Europe in the 12th century. It goes from the Ravad to Rabbi Yitzchak Sagi Nahor, his son. From there it goes to Gerona in Spain, Rabbi Ezra, Rabbi Azriel, Nachmanides, Moshe ben Nachman, were Nachmanides students like the Rashbar of Shlomo ben Aderet. From there to Rabbeinu Bechaya ben Asher, and then from there it moves to Castilla, from Castilla to Italy, from Italy to Tzfat. So the Ravad, who is the beginning of this new transmission, this new understanding of Kabbalah in Spain, in Provence at the time, and later in Spain, has a whole different take on Tchiat HaMetim. But since in his opinion, this is esoteric knowledge that he's not supposed to talk about, he doesn't say, I have a different tradition. He says to Rambam, I disagree. That's all he says. In other words, he doesn't want to say why he disagrees. So he says, you don't believe in it, something like that. It's very interesting, this whole concept. Okay. But let's get back to Rambam. Here it is. Okay, so he talks about Tchiat HaMetim, but he doesn't say a lot. You should know that man perforce must die and decompose and return to what he's composed of. So even if there's Tchiat HaMetim, even if there is a resurrection of the dead, people will die after that. Because human beings were not born to live forever. By the way, this is interesting. Rambam's concept of the resurrection of the dead is a one-time coming back to life. So his concept is really an idea of divine justice. Let me explain. Let's say somebody was a very righteous person, and they wanted to do a lot of good deeds and study Torah, make the world a better place. But lo aleinu, they died in a car accident at the age of 25. Or a terrible disease at the age of 30. Or there was a battle. Or there was a flood. So Rambam's wondering, what is divine justice here? Is it fair if a person gets their place in the world to come based on what they did in this life? What about all these people who didn't live a long life? Where is divine justice? Doesn't it say in the Torah, El emunah ve'ein avel tzadik v'yasharu, that God does everything according to justice? So Rambam understands Tchiat HaMetim as an act of divine justice, which means in the messianic era, when the world is a better place and there's no more wars, these people will be born again or maybe come back as adults. It's not clear, but they will come back and they will have a second chance to live their lives fully the way they wanted to do the first time. And then they will die again, but this time they'll have a better place in the world to come because they have achieved more in this world. This is the way Rambam understands Tchiat HaMetim, a concept of divine justice. Very, very different from the way the Kabbalists or the Zohar understand it. We'll get to that, but not today. But it's important to understand the way Rambam understands these things because all Rambam's understanding of Jewish eschatology, Jewish things that have to do with the end of days, whether it's the end of individual days, meaning the world to come, or collective days, the Messianic era, because Messianic era is for the collective people of Israel, not for the individual, of course. So in both sense, he tries to explain it both in the ways that are close to the verses and also something which he tries to understand rationally what exactly it means from the sources and from the Midrashim. This is in general his approach to Judaism in general. Okay. All that was an introduction. He did it, not me. He doesn't start with the Messianic era. He starts exactly the way we talked about. Another thing he says at the beginning is, before I talk about the reward, you should understand, you're not supposed to keep the Torah for reward. You're supposed to be a student of Avram Avinu, who's called by Yeshayahu Avram Ohavi, Avram my lover. When a person serves God out of love, they don't start thinking about the reward. That doesn't mean there isn't a reward. It just means that you should do something because you believe in that thing. There's an interesting question. Both Rav Joseph Albo, 15th century, in his book Sefer Ikarim, and much, much later, Rabbi Kook, in his Orot HaTorah, which is 20th century, they asked the same question. Why is it in the Bible there is no mention of an afterlife? You read the 24 books of the Tanakh, there's no mention. Immanuel Kant was friendly with Moses Mendelssohn in Germany. Mendelssohn, which was much elderly, there was at least 30 years between them, but they knew each other and they had discussions. And Kant once said to Mendelssohn, I don't understand your Bible. How can you have a Bible which doesn't believe in the summum bonum, in the reward, the ultimate reward in the world to come? I read the Jewish Bible. There's no world to come. So what's the point? Okay, which is very interesting. So you have the man who believes in the human being being ethically autonomous, right? Wonders why in the Jewish Bible there's no mention of the world to come. But the truth is, that's the reason. Rabbi Kook writes this very specifically in Orot HaTorah. Says, if the Bible were to talk about the world to come, it would dwarf any feelings that a person had of doing good in this world. Let me explain. If you're going to say to somebody, I want you to give charity, I want you to help the poor, I want you to respect your parents, I want you to save the world from poverty, I want you to stop wars. Why? So that you have a place in the world to come. You're making everything as a means to an end. If every good deed is a means to an end, it's worthless. That means that every good deed you're doing is just for a piece of that pie in the world to come. But the action itself means nothing. Understand the problem? That's why the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, chapter 1 says, "Vu ka'avadim hamshamshim ve'tarav shelo almanat lekabel pras." Be like the servant who serves the master, not to receive a reward. Because if you're doing everything for the reward, that means that you don't value what you're doing. It's meaningless. So if the Torah were to say the reason for the mitzvot is to have a place in the world to come, it's almost like the Torah is saying there's no meaning to the mitzvot, it's just for the world to come. That's the problem. Now, does that mean the Torah doesn't believe in the world to come? No. First of all, Torah Shabbal Peh is part of the Torah. Torah Shabbal Peh says, Kol Yisrael yesh lehem chelik b'olam haba. Right? That's this chapter, Perek Chelek. Secondly, the Torah itself believes in spirituality, nivuah, God, angels. There's obviously something there. So there's no reason to think that a human being can't live after life. There are also verses that, let's say, seem to hint to these ideas. Two famous verses from Kohelet, Ecclesiastes. Umi yodea et ruach habehema hayoredeti lamata veruach haadam haolai lamala. Who knows the spirit of animals that go downwards and the spirit of man goes upwards? Chapter 3. And then towards the end of Kohelet, v'hafar v'aguf yashuv el hafar v'hanefesh tashuv el Elohim asher netana. Right, the body goes down to the dust, and the soul goes back to God who gave it. Kohelet. Another place in Daniel, chapter 12. V'rabim yimishenei admat afar yakitzu, which seems to be referring to the resurrection of the dead. Many those who sleep in the dust will be awoken. Ele lechayei olam, those for eternal life. Ve'ele and others l'dera'on olam, for eternal decadence. So you do have these hints every now and then. But I think it's quite clear that if the Torah talked about the world to come, it wouldn't work. We would be in the same situation as the Quran, which is constantly talking about the fires of Gehinnom and the place of and Gan Eden as reward. And then, of course, everything you do, it doesn't matter. It's for the fires of Gehinnom and for the reward. As Rav Kook writes in Musar Avicha, if you keep away from transgression because you're afraid of punishment, and if you do the Torah because you want reward, then that has nothing to do with God. You're afraid of the punishment, you want the reward, that's not a relationship with God. It's nothing. Okay, there's some people, they can't have a relationship with the God. It doesn't make any sense for them. Okay, so for them, it's okay. But if you can, then you have to get past that. But there's a lot to say about that. Okay, let's go back to this. Let's go back to this. So, the days of Messiah. This is Valentin. Shalom. How are you? Very nice to see you.
Shalom, shalom. I hope you hear me well because I'm in a lobby. I have
That's
a bit of
okay.
time.
Okay.
Yeah,
Are you
I'm
back in
London.
Romania or you're still
No,
in
no,
Sweden?
no. I'm in Sweden. I took
Nice.
free time this weekend to
Okay.
go in a town in North Shopping near Stockholm.
Okay. Very, very nice to see you.
Very nice to see you.
Okay, let's continue. Now, watch what he's going to say here. The days of Messiah. What is the days of Messiah? The time when the rulership shall return to Israel. It means there will be a Jewish sovereign state in the land of Israel. This king will be very great. Remember, in Hebrew, Mashiach means anointed. Mashiach means anointed. By the way, in Christianity, it means exactly the same thing. Christos, Christ, means anointed. And that's why they have this idea of the king, their messianic king, who is anointed. The difference is, for us, the king is anointed as a king. He's a political leader. He doesn't, we'll see later, for Rambam, the messianic king does not do miracles. He might get prophecy, but for Rambam, prophecy is not miraculous. The fact that God can talk to you in your dream, that's not a miracle. That's just because you have a soul. So, miracle means that the laws of nature change. No laws of nature change when God gives you prophecy. You receive it in a dream. So, anyhow, let's see what he's saying here. The rulership will return to Israel, and the Jews will go back to their land. It's like it says in Devarim chapter 30 that God will gather your exiles. And this king will be very great. As it says in Hosea, eventually the Jews will come back to God and to David, their king, being a descendant of David. And he will be very great, as it says in Yeshayahu 41, when it's talking about the Messiah king. And his rulership will be in Zion, in Jerusalem, like it says in Yeshayahu chapter 2, that the nations will come to Jerusalem, to the house of Jacob, and say, please show us from the ways of your, teach us from your Torah. His fame will grow, and his mention will be among the nations. As it says in Tehillim, V'yerd miyam yam uminahar av se'aretz, more than the King Shlomo. Basically, everything Rambam is saying here, there are verses to back it up. All peoples will make peace with him, and all the lands will serve him due to his great righteousness, and due to the wonders that will come through him. The wonders that will come through him are social and political wonders, okay? It's not the splitting of the Red Sea. Believe me, world peace is definitely a miracle. It just doesn't change nature. It slightly changes human nature, but it doesn't change the laws of nature. And anybody who will come against this king, God, maybe he be elevated, will deliver into his hand. Remember, if you have a righteous king who brings world peace, there can be a lot of countries who are going to be really unhappy about that. Iran, China, North Korea, okay, maybe Russia. Okay, there are a lot of countries not going to be that happy about this messianic king trying to put world peace into place. Maybe the Economic Forum, I don't know who else. Okay. The point is that there's going to be a lot of people. So it has to be a battle against these people who are against peace. But God will deliver them to his hands. anybody who comes against him. And all the verses in scripture testify to his success and our success with him. Nothing about the existence will change from what it is now. Nature will not change, except that the rulership will return to Israel. This is what it says in the Talmud and Sanhedrin. Ein ben olam hazel yemot HaMashiach, la shi'abud malchuyot bilvad. There is no difference between the world as we know it today, the days of Messiah, except for the subjugation by the nations alone, which means we won't be subjugated to the nations anymore. We shall be free men and women in our land. And in those days, there still will be rich and poor people. There will be strong and weak people in relation to each other. Because, remember, rich and poor is not only about prosperity, it's a mindset. As I say, there's an expression, they say you can take the poor out of the slums, but you can't take the slums out of the poor. It's also a mindset, not just. So, because human nature won't change, there will be rich and poor. However, he says, in those days, it will be easier for people to find their sustenance. The point that with little effort a person exerts, he can have great output. For instance, I don't know, you have all these social media things, people talking about their diets and how it helped them, something new in medicine, or showing their new recipes, okay? A lot of people making a lot of money from all these things. So Rambam is saying the time will come, you'll make a lot of money for very simple, easy things. This is what it says in the tractate of Shabbat in the Talmud. In the future, the land of Israel will produce loaves of bread and woolen garments. Since people say that when a person finds something ready and prepared, it's as if they found their food already cooked, meaning it's a metaphor, not really that trees will have cookies and cakes on them, but it's a metaphor. It's like in Israel today, they say, well, this guy has a Dollar Tree in his backyard, which means he has a lot of money. Okay. That's what it means. And the proof from this is what it says, and foreigners shall be your plowmen and your vintners, show that they're still planting and reaping. The world will not change in the messianic era. It's the same world. And therefore the sage who said this statement to his students got very angry, and the students didn't understand his words, and they thought it was a simple meaning. They thought actually cakes would grow from trees. He didn't answer them because it says, do not answer a fool according to their folly. Okay, let's put that aside for a moment. The great objective that will occur in these days, what's called the messianic era, is that we shall rest from subjugation by the nations. There will not be any more exile. The galut will be over. Because this subjugation will prevent us from the performance of all the mitzvot. Because when life is difficult, it's hard to keep the mitzvot. That's what I said before for Rambam. What it says in Bechukotai and Vayikra, what it says in Kitavo, chapter 28 of Devarim, these are not rewards. These are the removing of the obstacles. When it says that there'll be peace on the land will give plenty of produce. It's the removing of obstacles. It's not the ultimate reward. The ultimate reward is the world to come. And it says the earth will be full of the knowledge of God, and wars will cease. As it says in Micha, and it says in Yeshayahu, nation will not live absurd against other nations, nor shall they learn war anymore, as it says in front of the UN building. And great wholeness will be found in those days. We will merit through these days life in the world to come, which is the goal for the individual. But the collective will have a better time in this world, and therefore they'll be able to achieve more, because our place in the world to come is based on our achievements in this world. But the world will be just like it is today. The laws of nature will not change. So what will change? There will be world peace. The Jews will leave the galut. They'll rebuild the temple, and they will have sovereignty. Now, the obvious comment would be, happen to be world peace. That doesn't happen, right? That's why I like describing this as not as impossible, but it seems to be improbable. Because based on the way we know human beings today, nobody seems to be really interested in world peace. Even when there's no need for war, there's a war, like Russia and Ukraine. Let's continue. The Messiah will die. Messiah doesn't live forever because nobody lives forever. And his son will reign in his place. And likewise, his grandson. The prophet has already said in Yeshayahu, he will not tire, he will not be crushed until he brings justice in the world. And it also says in Yeshayahu, Lo lamareinav yishpot, v'lo lemishnaos nav yochiach, v'haricho birat Hashem. He will smell the fear of God, and he'll be able to understand people. His rulership will extend for many days, many years, and the lives of people will lengthen, because when worries and troubles are removed, people live a long time. When you don't worry, when you don't have a lot of stress, no ulcers, get less heart attacks, your body works better, so you live longer. There was a fellow in Colombia, supposedly died at the age of 156. Okay, he didn't have a birth certificate, but that's what they said, 156. So they said to him, what is the secret for your longevity? How did you live for such a long time? He said 3 things. One thing is black coffee in the morning, a good cigar, and not to worry. And number 3, I think was the one was the best one. He forgot number 4, which is also to pick the right parents, because you also need good genes. But not to worry is a big part of it. Not to worry. So the point is, Rambam says that, when life is better, there are no wars, there's no disease. So, people can live the good life. And when you live the good life and you are happy, you also live longer. What was the name of that fellow who wrote a book about how he got over cancer with laughter therapy? You know what I'm speaking about? Cousins, I think his name was. The name was Cousins. Let me see if I can find it. It's a famous book, how he was able to overcome cancer through humor. Cousins, let's see if I can find it quickly. Cousins. Norman Cousins. There's an article about him called Norman Cousins Still Laughing. The name of his book was, oh, wow. Here, Norman Cousins. Norman Cousins was born to Jewish immigrant parents, Samuel Cousins and Sarah Babushkin Cousins. He lived in New Jersey. At age 11, he was misdiagnosed with tuberculosis and put in a sanatorium. He was an athletic youth, etc. etc. Wait a sec. No. Illness. He got a crippling connective tissue disease, which is called collagen disease, etc. Okay, I can't find it at the moment. He struggled with his illness and discovered laugh therapy. And in 1979, he wrote a book called The Anatomy of Illness as Perceived by the Patient. Anyhow, he wrote a book, Laughter Can Help You Overcome Illness. He used it to get over his own illness too. He had a degenerative disease, not cancer, excuse me. There was another woman, by the way, in New Jersey who did the exact same thing for cancer. This woman I heard because we until Corona, once a year we my family with in Montreal, we had this thing, in memory of my late sister Elizabeth, where we would bring women to speak at the synagogue in Montreal, Jewish women who were influencers. And there was this one woman, a Haredi woman from New Jersey, who did the same thing Norman Cousins. She used laughter therapy and comedy to help her overcome cancer, together with her treatments, of course, not instead of. And I think that we all know what's called the placebo effect. The placebo effect means if you believe you're going to get better, your mind will help you get better. I mean, this is scientific, because every scientific experiment needs a placebo group. You need a group which is placebo, because it's evident that you always will have people, when you give them something, even if it's a pill which has nothing in it except for sugar, they'll feel better, because the brain has control over the body. So when people are happy, life goes well, we get less diseases. It's just life. I mean, that's just a given. So Rambam is saying the same thing. So people will live longer for the simple reason that life will be worth living and better. So his rulership will extend for many days. Can you see this? Did I do it right? You can see it? Yes? Since when worries and troubles are removed, the days of men are lengthened. One should not wonder that his rulership will last for thousands of years, since the sages said about the gathering of the good, when the good people gather, will not quickly separate. What does that mean? I explain it like this. We're so used to the fact that we have many politicians in our parliaments. In Israel, we have 120. In Romania, what do they have, about 600 or something like that? How many again in the parliament in Romania?
I think about 500.
About
Let
500.
me check.
In Belgium, how many are in the Belgium parliament?
We have 3 or 4 parliaments, and I don't know the exact number.
Okay,
That's
so
Philippine
very
Parliament.
often you can get into the hundreds. Why is that? Because the assumption in democracy is that most people are there for self-interest, but if you have enough people looking at each other and making sure the other guy is not stealing, so, they'll hold themselves in check. So, if they're there for self-interest, they will do their jobs, right? I think it was Winston Churchill who said that the democracy is the worst type of government, excluding all the other possibilities. Meaning all the other possibilities don't actually work. So you need democracy. So a democracy, it moves slower, but it has checks and balances. And we have checks and balances because human nature, unfortunately, tends to be negative. When people look for power and self-interest, you need everybody balancing each other out. But let's say you had a parliament which was led by righteous people who really cared about everybody, altruistic, okay, really wanted to do things for people. Okay, whenever we see a politician like that, we say, they're not going to last very long. So, they're going to get trampled by all the others. And unfortunately, that happens a lot. But let's say you had a majority of your parliament, people like that. The people would start saying, wow, if these guys are like that, let's keep voting for them. So this is basically what Rambam is saying. If we actually had a system where the people at the top are righteous, people would be standing on the barricades to make sure that this doesn't change, because this is what we want. So if you could actually get the right people into government, people would realize that these people can actually do a lot. Most people figure, forget about the politicians. All they're going to do is self-interest. Nothing much you can expect there. But when it does happen and you have somebody, okay, unfortunately, sometimes you have good people, they're also voted out. Right? In Canada, just before Trudeau, we had a wonderful guy. He was voted out because the young people, sometimes, you just are very impressionable and not always well informed. That's exactly, unfortunately, what happened. So, yeah, what can you do? Okay, so let's get back to Rambam. We're almost finished. Let me read this to the end then. Sorry about that. Not this one, I'm sorry. Where'd it go? And heading here. Rambam continues, we do not desire and hope for the days of Messiah because of the multitude of wealth, produce, not to ride on horses or drink wine accompanied by song. Some people of the confused intellect imagine. The prophets and the pious ones wanted the days of Messiah, longed for it because of what would be of the gathering of the righteous, and the proper administration and wisdom, and the righteousness of the king and his uprightness, his wisdom and closeness to God. As it says, Lord said to me, you are my son, I conceive you today. And the performance of all the commandments of the Torah, Moshe, our teacher, without negligence and laziness, etc., etc. And it says, since all will know me, from their small ones to their big ones, I have placed my Torah in their hearts, and I will remove this heart of stone from your flesh, and etc., etc. And through these matters, we will strongly attain life in the world to come. Of course, is for every individual, as it says, all of Israel has a place in the world to come, etc., etc. Okay, let me try to summarize this up because we're at the end of our hour. I want to try to explain what Rambam is saying here, how interesting this is. For Rambam, the world to come, the Messianic era is not a miraculous era. I'll show you next week. He says that specifically in a few places in his Mishnah Torah. And he proves it, by the way, a very good proof. Bar Kochva, Rabbi Akiba, and all the rabbis of the Mishnah thought Bar Kochva was the Messiah until he failed after 3.5 years. Bar Kochva did no miracles. Says that's the best proof that the Messianic king does not have to do a miracle. What does he have to do? He has to fulfill the goals of the Messianic era. What are the goals of the Messianic era? Number 1, returning Jewish sovereignty to the land of Israel. Number 2, returning, and by the way, the fact that he says a king doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be a monarchy. That's the only thing they knew in those days. It has to be a leadership, political leadership. It doesn't necessarily have to be a monarchy. There are even discussions like that in the halakha, by the way, but this is not the place for it at the moment. So there has to be Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel, in gathering of the exiles, which means the galut is over for the Jews, the exile is over. And here he doesn't say it, but he does say in his Mishnah Torah, the rebuilding of the temple, and finally world peace. You know, I've always said, if you have an individual who will bring back the sovereignty of the Jews to the state of Israel, bring back the Jews to the state of Israel, create world peace and build the temple, hey, I'm okay with him being the Messiah. Fine. Okay. Basically, the Messianic era is based on the goals. It's not based on the person. The person is a means to an end. They have to bring these goals to manifestation. So the question isn't who's the Messiah. That's not a question. The question is what happened. And the best example, the best proof for that is Bar Kochva. When Bar Kochva fought the Romans, recaptured Jerusalem. So Rabbi Akiva and his peers, they thought, wow, it's happening. It's not because they had a belief in Bar Kochva, because they believed that God would help them. When they failed, they realized it was the wrong time. Mistake. It happens. But when it does happen, and things start moving forward, then it becomes, as we say in Hebrew, Reshit Tzmichat Gulatenu, the beginning of the growth of our redemption. The Midrash says in a few places, one is in Megillat Esther and Eicha Rabati. It talks about 4 sages who were contemporaries of Rabbi Akiva, who were walking in the Arbel Valley. And they saw the first sign of what's called Ayelet HaShachar, which is the first glimpse of light when you're standing on the top of a mountain. We call it the Nates. We call it in Hebrew Alot HaShachar or Ayelet HaShachar, the first light. They said, Kachi Gulatan Shel Yisrael. This is the way the redemption of Israel happens. First, there's a little bit of light, then it gets stronger and stronger until the darkness is all gone. But it's a process. Rambam doesn't talk about it this way, but the Midrash does talk about it this way. But for Rambam, the main difference is it's a world which actually works. And let me just dwell on this for a moment. I'm sorry if I'm stealing your time. Let me dwell on this for a moment. What does it mean, Ein ben olam hazeh, the world as we know it in the Messianic era? What's the difference? The difference is like this. I'm going to be very straightforward. We live in a sick world, a world where leadership tolerates war, where you're allowed to start a war for political gain, even though human lives are going to be lost, as if humans are expendable. We live in a world where every day there is murder and theft and rape, and we tolerate it. Hey, they're police, they arrest them. We don't live in a normal world. That's not a normal world. You know, NASA sends out this beam into outer space looking for aliens. Nobody's answered us. Does that mean there are no aliens? In my opinion, no, there are aliens. Why don't they answer NASA? Are you kidding? You think they want to come to this place? This is a crazy world. They just see what's happening here on their television monitors. Oh my goodness, we don't want to go to Earth. They're going to blow themselves up one day. So they live in, you know, maybe really, if they're intellectual beings like us, why would they want to come here? If you saw what was happening in Ukraine, would that be the first place on your agenda to go to Kiev? Maybe the Dundas? Okay, obviously not. So my point is, you know, but we got so used to the fact that that's the way the world is. What can you do? There are wars. You know, we see children fighting in kindergarten, say, what can you do? They're children. But if they're adults, oh, that's politics. It's crazy, crazy. So somebody's got to make seder. Somebody has to arrange things again, put the order back, you know. So this is a problem. One other thing. Rambam believes, by the way, that this world will never end. It says in Kohelet, V'ha'aretz olam omedet. It says in Ecclesiastes, the world always stands. Rambam does not believe there will be the end of the world. Even though in the book of Jubilees and the Apocrypha it talks about the end of the world, doesn't believe in it. It says the world will always continue. Human beings go to the world to come, but I mean, this world will just continue. There's no reason to think differently. There might be a few reasons, but okay. Let's say that's what he says. No reason to think differently. What is the Messianic era from Rambam? When human beings grow up, when we become mature for the first time. The world we are living in, pre-Messianic era, is prehistory. Human history has not started yet for Rambam. We're still living in a primitive society where it's okay to use war to settle arguments. By the way, look that up in political dictionaries. War is the way that human beings settle arguments when the verbal discussions have ended. It's considered legitimate. Let's just kill people. That's okay. So we live in this primitive prehistorical time. Now remember, if the world is eternal, according to Rambam, and let's say the Messianic era is going to start at a certain point. Rambam doesn't care about dates. He doesn't care when the Messianic era is going to start. It's not like the Talmud, which when we talk about the Zohar is very into dates. But it says at some point, if you have a line which is infinite, every point on that line is as far away from the end as the beginning, right? Mathematically, you have an infinite line. Any point on that line is as far away from the end of the line as the beginning of the line. Because that's what an infinite line is, by definition. Which means whenever on this line, the Messianic era will start, it's not the end of the world, it's the beginning. If you follow what I'm saying. For Rambam's understanding, we live in prehistory. When the Messianic era starts and there's world peace, that's the point of humanity. Sounds a little bit depressing when you think about it that way, but we can push it and we can get it. And you know, if we push the world to that, that's a big schut, a big marriage. That's his understanding. That's what it's all about. It's about bringing world peace, bringing the Jews back to their home, because what the Jews do is reflected in the whole world. And And somebody's got to take care of the mess. Toda rabba. I wish everybody happy to be Shvat. And next week, I'll finish off Rambam again, just some quotes from his Mishnah Torah. And then what I'd like to do, because we started off very differently, we started off, if you remember, with Joseph and Judah. I'd like to go back, after we discussed Rambam, I'd like to go back to the sources, Zohar sources and sources about how the Kabbalists, specifically in the Beit Midrash of the Vilna Gaon, and before him, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, understood the process of redemption, which is different than Rambam, but Rambam has to be appreciated. There's a lot to appreciate in the way he presents this concept, which I think has a universal message to it, which I think is very pertinent, especially today. Shalom, shalom, everyone.
תודה רבה.
Bye.